Yeah.
Welcome back, everyone. Yeah, exactly. We'll divide it up there too. We'll be very traditionalist. Okay, so welcome back together. Welcome to the story of us. We are still sitting in the same time period. We are spending more time at this moment around the year zero than I think just about any moment we have touched so far. A few reasons for this. Part of it is just there are so many different movements that come out of this moment that end up determining the future of Jewish history and how we understand ourselves, as well as the future of world history and world religions. And this is the moment that it explodes out of that space. But it's also just how much historical information we can get from this moment. All of a sudden, once we get into the Roman era, the historical records are huge. And part of that has to do with being closer to where we are now. Part of it has to do with Romans and the way that they would keep records. And part of it has to do with the ways that by the time we get to the Roman era, meaning around the year zero or so, Jews are no longer Judeans. Right? It's not to say that we don't live in the province of Judea. It isn't to say that that isn't the center of Jewish identity and Jewish ethnicity and so on and so forth, but that Jews are Jews rather than Judeans. We have solidly become a people, a tribe, and not a region with the people who reside in it. Did that make sense, what we just said?
Mm-hmm.
Any thoughts or questions on that? Because I think that's a really important setup before we keep moving on. Zoomers, I'm just looking out. Any questions?
Approximately what year was that?
So this process that we're talking about, let me give some background here, Karen. So around the year let's go even before that. 586 BCE, the Babylonians invade Judea. They cart off our leadership into exile. Somewhere between 10 to 30,000 people probably are taken off as slaves into exile. Overwhelmingly, the literate class are taken away. While we are living in Babylonian and then Persian exile, the Torah, and in particular the Exodus narrative, becomes the center of the Jewish story. Right? It makes sense. We are an enslaved people in a foreign land, so of course the story of a previous enslavement in a foreign land takes on new centrality and new importance to us. So simply the authorship of the Torah that comes out of the Persian experience, call that 450 BCE or so, is a big step on the creation of Jewish rather than Judean identity. Literally, we have a text that is portable that we can carry with us anywhere. The next step is Alexander the Great and the spread of Hellenism. This opens up an empire to us to go live in, and Jews, Judeans, end up living in a lot of these places. So all of a sudden, it's not just the Jews are in Judea, and it's not just that we're in Judea and Persia and Babylon. It's also that we are spreading into the Greek cities of the Middle East and North Africa.
I can help.
Most notably, Alexandria in Egypt. Right, just over 1 million Jews outside of Judea by that point. Now we're talking the 300s BCE into the 200s BCE. So this Hellenized group of Jews are invested in creating a Jewish identity, a Jewish life, Jewish rituals and cultures that exist outside of the context of Judea, because it's just simply too far for them. Right? You can't have a society and a civilization that's based around showing up 3 times a year at the temple in Jerusalem when you live really far away from Jerusalem. So there's all sorts of examples of this in the Greek era. We have temples, Jewish temples, that are built outside of Israel, but we also just have a development of Jewish life and civilization and thought and religious practice and all of these pieces outside of connection to Israel. All of this leads up to the moment that we have been delving into these last few weeks, and we're going to move forward 100 years or so today. We're going to focus around the year 200 CE on our side of zero, when there is no more temple. And the only option of doing Jewish is extra temple Judaism and extra temple Jewish culture. That's really the background we've been looking at these last few weeks. We have the first great rebellion against Rome around the year 68 CE. All of these numbers are on our side of zero now. This is disastrous. It leads to the destruction of the temple in Jerusalem. But from a Roman perspective, this is one of many, many small attempted rebellions and revolutions against the empire that's coming out of this troublesome Jewish area. And in fact, the reason that they crushed the temple and destroyed Jewish civilization from 68 to 70 is less about the particulars of that rebellion and more about how this had become a very problematic pattern for the empire. Around the year 100 CE, Jews, remember we've got a million and a half of them, maybe even more than that, living throughout the empire at this point. Jews throughout the empire rebel against Rome in the places where they are living, and this is so disastrous for the Jewish communities that we don't even have a lot of evidence or information about this, because these communities, many of them, are literally just wiped off out the map. The people are killed or deported or enslaved, in the places that they had lived are torn down. So we don't even have a lot of information on this other than it is another disaster. And then in the 130s, we have the last gasp of Jewish sovereignty, really until the Zionist era, almost 1,800 years later or something, 1,700 years later. And this is known as the Bar Kokhba Rebellion. This is another just disastrous rebellion by the Zealots. We've looked at some of the Zealots against Rome. Some of these people end up hiding out on Masada. You get the Masada stories. By the way, we're not talking too much about Masada during this era, but be prepared. We are going to talk about Masada during the Zionist era, because Masada as Zionist mythology is really formative and really important, particularly in right-wing Zionist mythology. I am aware, by the way, of the ways that, particularly in the last few months, that word Zionist has like weight and meaning. When I am talking about Zionist, I am talking about the 1800 and 1900 era movement to create a Jewish nation state in the historic land of Israel that ultimately resulted in the creation of the geopolitical reality of the state of Israel. So when I'm talking the Zionist era, that is the era that I am talking about. I'm not talking about our contemporary politics, though we'll get there eventually as well. Okay. Yeah. Assuming the world still exists in a few months, we will get to that era too in our story. Okay. Any questions, comments, thoughts on the background we just presented in the context before we keep moving forward? Just a reminder, Zoomers, you can unmute yourself and interrupt. You can hit the little reactions button and raise your hand within Zoom. Or even if you just start like waving dramatically across your screen, I will see you. And yeah, Toby.
In one of the Passover Sidurs, that Haggadahs that we have, it talks about some of the rabbis plotting all night during Passover. And what they were plotting was the Bar Kokhba revolution, which made it sound like it was just a really religious, wonderful thing to do. And here we're finding out how disastrous it was.
Yes, that is a really important question, Toby, and I really appreciate that. We're going to focus in on this idea today. And Rudy, I see your hand. I'll get to you in a second. I really hope one of the big takeaways that folks are having is how political all of this is. It's just when we're not in that era, we forget the politics of the era, and so we treat it as religious. I really hope we are seeing the early Christians and the early rabbis and the Jesus movement, and these are political movements. They are theological in nature as well, but thinking of them as religious is really a misnomer. These are political movements in the same way that the rise of Islam is a political movement, in the same way that the Crusades are these are political movements at political moments. the comparison I keep coming back to for us is Iraq under American occupation. Americans are the Romans, the Iraqis are the Jews, in sort of this comparison here. And the realities of an ongoing military occupation result in political movements against the occupation that also have theological wrappings around them. Mm-hmm. Right? We've mentioned ISIS a few different times, but ISIS is a political movement that is a response to American occupation that's wrapped up in theology, or the Islamic State. Or
is that true of some of the other terrorist movements?
Yeah, this is just a really common thing that you find almost everywhere. So, Toby, what I would say, your question about the rabbis and the Bar Kokhba rebellion is you can't separate out the Bar Kokhba rebellion from the rabbinic movement. A few weeks ago, we really looked at Rabbi Akiva and his character, and Akiva is, if not the main messianic figure of the Bar Kokhba rebellion, the secondary messianic figure of the Bar Kokhba rebellion. So no, you cannot separate out these peoples from their politics, which I'm just going to keep going a little bit, and then we'll stop for questions again. And Rudy, I'm not forgetting you. Because one of the things we're going to talk about today, Toby, which feels like a good jumping off point, is going back to the ways that the Jesus movement became the Christian movement. The ways that the Jesus movement stopped being Jewish and became a non-Jewish phenomenon. And a big part of this, remember, from the Roman perspective, we have these ongoing rebellions, which are a real problem for them. Constantly, they're having to send the army in to quash these rebellions over and over and over again. Feels like every decade they're having to do this. So it's in all of the non-power holding groups' interests to distance themselves against those who are causing trouble with the Romans. It's why the rabbis go to such lengths to distance themselves from the zealots. It's why that whole story, remember a few weeks ago we looked at the story of Rabbi Yochanan. Jerusalem was under siege, and this is the mythic telling of it. It's probably not historical, but Rabbi Yochanan makes a deal with the Romans, sneaks out while Jerusalem's under siege, and makes a deal with the Romans. You can come and destroy Jerusalem. Let me have Yavne. Let me create a place where we can teach Judaism, but not Jewish nationalism. That's basically the deal that the rabbinic movement makes, is to have Jewish identity that is non-nationalistic. And this is not political, this is pragmatic. There is an understanding amongst the rabbis that nationalism, in this case rebellion against Rome, is going to lead to further destruction and perhaps the total destruction of the Jewish people. We're going to look at the Mishnah today, so this is going to be a little out of order what I'm saying here. But one of the things that's interesting, the Mishnah written in the year 200, which lays out Jewish law, doesn't mention Hanukkah. Why does it not mention Hanukkah? Because Hanukkah is a dangerous story that can be used to spur people towards rebellion and revolution and make them convinced that they can win. So the rabbis leave it out of the Mishnah altogether. Eventually, it ends up in the Gemara, in the Talmud, that's coming a few weeks from now, and hundreds of years after the time period we're looking at. But even there, the real story of Hanukkah is erased, and instead we get a children's story about oil lasting. Okay, other questions, other thoughts? Rudy?
Well, can you unmute everybody?
If we're going to unmute everyone, let's do it at the end.
Oh, it's something for you.
Everyone can unmute themselves. Can we hold it for the very end, Rudy? Is that okay?
Does he want to do something?
I have one other question. Did the rabbis think it was going to be easier to transfer Judaism from the cult at the temple and everything without Jerusalem being around?
So I wouldn't say that the rabbis thought it would be easier. I would say that the rabbinic legitimacy and authenticity, meaning Jews actually accepting the rabbinic perspective, which says that there's this other way of doing Jewish, that there's this oral tradition, not just the written tradition, that wasn't going to be possible as a mainstream Jewish reality as long as not just the temple was around, right? The temple was destroyed in 68 or 70. The way that we can think of Bar Kokhba rebellion, the other way of thinking of it, is that this is the end of Jews believing that we can rebuild the temple anytime soon. We have all sorts of projects in the decades following the destruction of the temple. There are all sorts of projects of trying to get the temple rebuilt, and in fact, there's even a moment where there's a Roman emperor who it seems maybe has granted permission, but doesn't get started, and then there's a new emperor that comes in that turns over the permission.
That's
But
where I am in the book.
yeah, there you go. Oh yeah, it's in the book. As a Driven Leaf is the book that Nancy's referencing. But it's after Bar Kokhba where that stops being a real possibility, and so the rebuilding of the temple stops being a rallying cry for Jews all over. And that rallying cry, again, the temple, don't get lost in the religious nature of this all. Today we think of it in religious terms. The temple is a symbol. It's much closer to the White House being destroyed and eventually rebuilding the White House. That's what we're talking about here. Right? If we live in an era where America is invaded by, I don't know, pick your people, Canadians. Actually, that sounds kind of like liberation. The Russians invade Canada. Invade America, destroy the White House. 100 years go by, right? There's still going to be movements to reestablish America and rebuild the White House. Once we stop trying to rebuild the White House, what that really means is that we've stopped trying to recreate this past. So that's what we're talking about with the temple. Don't get stuck on the religious pieces of it all. Karen Kalish.
Oh, what is the real story of Hanukkah?
Oh, the real story of Hanukkah, you can go backwards a few weeks. I can find you a link when we covered it, if you'd like.
Okay, never mind.
You can give her a quickie.
Yeah, the short version is that it's somewhere between a civil war between radical fundamentalist Taliban-like Jews living in the countryside and Greek assimilated Jewish urbanist, cosmopolitan, educated folks who are collaborators with Greek Empire living in cities.
So none of this oil lasting 8 nights.
No, exactly. And the importance of that oil lasting 8 nights is that the rabbis, meaning the people around the era we're talking, 100, 200, so that's still 400 or 500 years after the Maccabees, 300 years after the Maccabees, go with that story because it's not dangerous. It's not dangerous in terms of inspiring people to rebellion, but it's also not dangerous in terms of collaborating with the Romans. Because if the rabbinic project of maintaining Jewish identity outside of Jewish nationalism is to succeed, then it's going to require good relationships with the Romans. This is the exact same reason.
That's the real story. So I'll just read it. I don't want to take up anybody's time.
So that's the exact same reason why the early Christian movement, particularly once it becomes the early Christian movement, meaning the people who are not Jewish and are a part of this, why it becomes so anti-Jewish. Right? This becomes anti-Semitism as time goes by. Right? Centuries and millennia later, these early Christian texts, which are so anti-Jewish, become the really justifications for terrible, terrible anti-Semitism. But during the time period, this wasn't about anti-Jewishness. This was about all of these small rebel groups or splinter groups of Jewish identity trying to not get in trouble with the Romans. That was the local politics. And this is what I meant when we talked at the beginning about all politics, all of these pieces being deeply political, even as we forget the political nature of them from their moment. Oop, is that someone asking a question? I'm just going to hit the mute all button again. As always, feel free to unmute yourself if you have questions or thoughts. I thought I saw someone with a question before also. Was there someone else waving? No. Okay, so let's keep moving forward. We are going to get to about the year 200 CE today. That is when we are going to zoom in. And we're going to zoom in on a particular text today, one of the most important texts for contemporary Judaism and for contemporary Jewish identity, the Mishnah. So first, just a note, there's a lot of different texts that sound like this. We are talking about the Mishnah, N-A-H at the end. That is not to be confused with the Mishnah Torah, which is both one of the names that the rabbis give for the book of Deuteronomy, because it's a repetition of the book of Deuteronomy, of the rest of the Torah, and it's the name of a later document by Maimonides about 1,000 years after this. So that is not what we are talking about. We are talking about the Mishnah. The Mishnah is the core, the root, the beginning of the Talmud, and is the beginning of the rabbinic project, at least the rabbinic project when it comes to text. Okay, so year 200, or the late 2nd century, we're living in this world of destruction. We are living in this world where it no longer seems possible to rebuild the temple. It no longer seems possible to imagine Jewish sovereignty in Judea, where it really is increasingly impossible to even imagine stable Jewish civilization around Jerusalem. Jews have gathered in the north, in an area that was not Judea for a lot of the time, around the Galilee, as we saw in some of those maps we looked at. But Jews have gathered around the Galilee, which is farther away from the political capital, a little less heat of the Romans. And then, of course, there is the Jewish population living throughout the empire in Alexandria, and then the Jewish population outside of the empire, the Jews who never left Babylon. So you can see why, as things were getting bad for Jews in the Roman Empire, why the Jews of Babylon would begin to take on new importance once again. Make sense, yeah? So the rabbinic movement at its core, these fringy people we've been looking at who did not have mainstream acceptance, who were not seen as purveyors of an authentic Judaism, their big idea, the big idea is at the moment of revelation, when the Torah is given from God to Moses at Mount Sinai, that there was also an oral tradition that was taught to Moses as well that has been passed through time. There are these rabbis, or people who are associated with the rabbinic movement, even if they themselves are not rabbis, who would go around and be sort of traveling storytellers of rabbinic sayings and ideas and how to do Jewish this way. These are folks called Tanas, T-A-A-N-A, I believe is how it's usually spelled. Tanaim is the plural here of them. These are people who have memorized sections of the oral Torah and serve essentially as walking books of the oral Torah. So often you would have a Tana, a memorizer, and a rabbi. A rabbi, remember, is not a priest. It's not a religious, even as they would have thought of religious, which is quite different from us. It's not a religious descriptor. It's someone who is qualified and trained to interpret Jewish law. That is what a rabbi is. We can talk about what rabbis became in the United States, etc., when we get further on. But that is historically what the rabbis are. Not even necessarily someone you would want by your bedside if you were dying or going through a tough time. Or these are interpreters of Jewish law. So you would have a rabbi and a Tana who would go from town to town, and the Tana would read out the pieces of the oral Torah that had been memorized, and the rabbis would explain and interpret and sermonize and etc., etc. So by the time we get to the late 2nd century, we've had all of these rebellions and all of these destructions, and we no longer believe we can reestablish the temple, and we no longer believe that we can reestablish a Jewish nation state. What happens is there's a real fear that these traditions are going to be lost, that they are going to disappear. And so a guy named Yehuda Hanassi, Judah the Prince, this is one of these names, if you're going to memorize names, this is one of those just to sort of hang a hat on here. Yehuda Hanassi, he's a prince because he's rich. That's why they call him a prince. So Yehuda Hanassi, one of the great rabbis of this period. By the way, when we talk about the rabbis, we are always talking about the people of this period. In the middle of services, when I talk about the great rabbis, we are talking about this period. Sometimes they're called the sages, or the other phrase you'll hear for them is Chazal, which is an acronym for Chachamim Zichronam Livracha, the wise ones of a blessed memory. But Chazal, that's the sort of Jewish vocabulary term. Chazal is how I would spell it. Yehuda Hanassi gathers these Tanas, all of these walking memorizers of the oral Torah, and sets out to create a written anthology of the sayings of the oral Torah. And that's really what the Mishnah is. It is a written anthology of the sayings of the oral Torah. It is not a how-to guide to Jewish law or Jewish living. All too often, there's a question and 7 answers, and then you move on. Instead, this is a document that establishes what I would call the boundaries of the rabbinic Jewish conversation, and is a first attempt to really write Jewish civilization into text. We stop at this moment, for 2,000 years being a place where you can inculcate Jewish identity and culture by living somewhere. Right? That's how Moroccan identity works, and Irish identity works, and American and identity everywhere works by living in that place and speaking the language and eating the food and studying going to school there. And this is the moment when we make it portable in a really definitive kind of way. Even as the rabbis are still pretty fringy and not very accepted by this point. So Yehuda Hanassi gathers all of these folks together in this project of writing the oral Torah, writes it down, this anthology, as the Mishnah. We're going to look at some text from the Mishnah. Almost immediately, we are told that the Mishnah is sent to the Jews of Babylon. In the mythological telling, it's almost like it must have arrived with trumpets and elephants and all when really it's just someone was traveling and brought it with them and dropped it off, I'm sure. But the mythology that this was sent from Israel to Babylon, I think the real piece of mythology that we're supposed to pick up there, the real story, is that once again Jewish civilization was changing its center. No longer was Jewish civilization going to be centered in Judea, in Israel. By this time, I believe it's been renamed Palestine by the Romans as a way of de-Judaizing the space. Again, pushing back on Jewish nationalism and all these rebellions. And instead, this is the moment. The sending of the Mishnah becomes the symbolic moment where once again Babylonian Jewry, Persian Jewry, up north Jewry is the center of Jewish life. Okay, let's pause again for thoughts and questions before we jump into the Mishnah itself.
I dropped one in the chat. What were these Ta'anim people doing before this period? Like, how did they know? How did they memorize something that wasn't written down? Like, I'm used to, like, it's written down, I'm going to memorize it. So, like, yeah, where were these people before?
Isn't that the same as the Griot? Isn't that what who learned the past?
Yeah, look, in the ancient world, there are long traditions of oral histories that are passed down in sacred ways.
Yeah. Right. Like you can tell the story of how your parents met, and that's not written down.
Yes,
right.
Yes.
It might be, I don't know.
But there is some background here, and there's a lot of scholarly debate around this. So one of the things that we see in the Mishnah itself is there are a few references that seem to suggest that Mishnayot, meaning individual verses that don't have attribution, should be attributed to Rabbi Meir. You'll remember Rabbi Meir's teacher is Acher, the other, right? And that's what we looked at there, the problematics of that. But Rabbi Meir's other teacher is Rabbi Akiva, who we looked at the problematics of Rabbi Akiva as well. But there's some other references that talk about the Mishnah of Rabbi Akiva. So one of the scholarly theories is that there is an early collection, perhaps a written collection of Mishnayot that was put together by Akiva, and then maybe a later collection by Meir, maybe an expansion of Akiva's collection by Meir, and then we get the official version that ends up being put together by Rabbi Yehuda Hanassi, Judah the Prince. But even that's not the end of it. We have a document that's put together called the Tosafot, which means the additional pieces. Think of this as the B-sides to the Mishnah. The Mishnah is sort of all the A-sides, the Tosafot is the B-sides. Be careful, by the way, we're going to get words that sound like Tosafot a few more times in Jewish history, and we're talking about very different things at those moments that we're talking about them. But this is a collection of the B-sides of the Mishnahs. And then once we get later and the Gemara is written, we have all sorts of references to other Mishnahs called Braitas that aren't in either of those collections but seem to still being passed down orally. But another answer to your question, Samantha, is that we can see some of the origins of the Mishnah as an oral document in some of the ways that it's told. It's organized by topic, but it's also got some places where it is organized with mnemonics, and you can see them. Here's a series of things that have to do with the number 3. Here's a series of things that have to do with the number 7. Sometimes they'll even tell you a mnemonic that makes no sense. This is the famous mnemonic for Minibigababa. And they'll say it like that, with this series of letters that mean nothing. But if you remember the order of the letters, you can remember all the things that come after it. And that's those are the places we see the origins of this as a written, or as an oral document. You should tell us.
They're muted.
You gotta unmute.
Are you talking about me?
Talking about you.
Okay, quick question, foolish question, but where does Jeremiah and Isaiah, the prophets, fit in here?
So the prophetic period is over by this point, meaningfully over. The prophets really are responding to the great wars that came before this. The prophets are mostly responding to the Assyrian invasions in the 700s BCE, and then to the Babylonian invasions around 586 BCE. We've got some other semi-prophetic literature, like the Book of Daniel, which is actually the story of Hanukkah as told through the story of the Babylonians. And Daniel is sort of prophetic literature, but as a genre, prophets have really fallen out by this point, Ben, is what I would say. Prophets,
several hundred years before what we're talking about right now.
Yes, by and large, you don't have prophets as a social phenomenon post-Babylonian exile. It's not entirely strictly true, but it is sort of true. And even the prophets that you get post-Babylonian exile tend to be much less like the old prophets and much more like end of days, eschatological, messianic, afterlife kind of stuff, what you'd expect with the Book of Daniel, and also the sorts of literature that you find in the Dead Sea Scroll community. Okay, any other thoughts before we jump in and actually look at some Mishnah? Okay, here we go. I'm going to spotlight this for everyone, hopefully make it big enough for everyone to see. This is from Sefaria.org. As always, this is my favorite place to read from, really one of the great contributions to Jewish civilization. When you are reading Sefaria, particularly the Talmud, and this is part of the Steinsaltz translation, what is in bold is actually in the Mishnah. What is not in bold comes from commentaries or added context for pieces like this. Let me say one more thing about the Mishnah, which is that it is written in Hebrew, which is even after Hebrew is no longer the spoken language of Jews. So it's one last piece of nationalism, I would say, that we have here. And you can find this throughout history, that these resurgences of languages really are connected to nationalist movements and identity movements. I've said this joke before, but of course the difference between a dialect and a language is an army. And I know, I love this joke because it's so true, and it says something so true about being a human. But we don't see really Hebrew as a language for Jewish documents other than the prayer book until the Spanish Golden Age, when we once again see a rise in Jewish nationalism. So it's often connected to these things. The Mishnah, for those of you who have a little bit of Hebrew knowledge and Hebrew skill, is some of the most accessible, easy to translate Hebrew out there. Again, because it's being written by and written for Jews who this is not their everyday language. So it's a great place to work on your translation skills and your Hebrew skills, and it's much closer to modern Hebrew than biblical Hebrew is. So, okay, let's go ahead and look here. Where's my button again? Okay. Is there someone who would like to read? I'm going to have you read mostly the bold. We will skip the other words.
I can read.
I can.
I'm going to have someone here read it only because I have been told that it records better on the Zoom when other people read it.
From when does one recite Shema in the evening?
Okay, so the first question that they're asking, and this is the first tractate of the Mishnah, Brachot, this has to do with blessings and the creation of prayer as we know it. But most of the Mishnah is not religious. Prayer feels religious to us today. Most of the Mishnah is not religious. We just happen to be starting here. Okay, what's the real question that they're asking? If you can recite, when can you recite Shema in the evening? What's that a way of saying?
Just when is the day over?
When is evening?
Yeah.
Yeah, when is the day over? When are these boundaries? If you're supposed to say Shema twice a day, and this is a rabbinic idea, that you should say Shema twice a day, in the morning and in the evening, when you rise up and when you lie down. When is evening and when is morning? Those of you who did Tractate Brachot in Talmud on Tuesdays for years have heard me say this over and over again. But you have to understand this as being an attempt by the rabbis to get people to join into their movement. That's what's happening here. They are creating their own legitimacy through this project. And if you can get people to show up at your synagogues once or twice a day, it's a really good way of getting them committed to your project, right? This is just obvious. It's the same sociology of get people to show up at CRC events, and then maybe we can eventually pay our bills.
And people feel connected.
And people feel connected, and people feel akin, and exactly. So prayer and the creation of prayer, and that's what's happening in Brachot, is the creation of prayer, is the creation of authenticity and legitimacy for the rabbinic project. That is what is happening here. And we miss how radical this is. We really do, because we live in a world of prayer, where prayer is normative. But the reality is that if you live in a universe where the way that you commune with your deity is through barbecue by a special cast of people who have to be born into it and do this barbecuing at a special place, the idea that it is a replacement to sit with a group and mumble words is wild, right? I mean, it's wild. And it's part of the reason why people just totally reject this. Like, what are you doing? They look like religious fanatics because they're religious fanatics. Where all of a sudden, instead of the regular like barbecue, everyone's gathering together and mumbling.
You don't have to memorize stuff.
Yeah, right? So getting people on board with prayer was how you got people on board with the rabbinic project as a whole. So that is really the theme of Tractate Brachot. It's not blessings. It's not the creation of prayer. It's the creation of rabbinic legitimacy and authority. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm.
Any confusion on that? Because it's a really important point. Okay, let's keep going. Okay, so when does one recite the Shema? Now we get an answer.
From the time when the priest entered to partake of their teruma.
Yeah, okay, so the Truma is one of the daily offerings that happens inside the operations of the temple. So when we've studied this, by the way, in Talmud, we spend a lot of time in discussion, but for the sake of brevity, I'm just going to sort of give the answers here, even as there's lots of depth to go into that we can discover together. There's no more temple. So there's no more priests operating in a temple. So you can't show up. By the time the Mishnah is being written around the year 200, you cannot show up anywhere to find out what time the priests go in to eat their section of the offerings of the barbecue that they get to keep. It's impossible. You can't do it. And yet the very first answer in the Mishnah is based on the priests. Why is this?
Because that's what people are familiar with.
It's what people are familiar with, though again, they're not familiar with it anymore because it doesn't happen anymore. Maybe you have memories of it if you're quite old, but more than likely, actually, it's your grandparents who had memories of it, who talked to you about what it was like when the temple was around.
But you've heard of it, and that gives it the legitimacy.
Everyone knows the temple is legitimate. This is an effort to tie the rabbinic project to the temple. When can you say the Shema? Well, it's almost like the rabbis are telling you that the priests would go in and say the Shema, which later on, the rabbinic tradition will absolutely say that. The later Talmudic tradition is going to say, oh yeah, the priests were rapping tefillin and saying Shema, and we're all these things that are, right? Okay. From the time when they partake of their truma. And maybe I'll just read this and take us through. It's one of the offerings that was had every day, meaning one of the pieces of barbecue.
Okay.
Or the other way of saying when the priests partake of their truma is supper time for the priests.
Okay.
Then we get another answer. Until the end of the first watch. Again, this is based on the priests. We're talking about the cycle where priests would have shifts in the temple because it's a job. And we're told this is the statement of Rabbi Eliezer. So it's put in Rabbi Eliezer's name. Then the rabbis say, meaning the unnamed group, the consensus group says, until midnight. Okay? So first we got an answer that was based on the operations of the temple. Then we get an answer that is based on the way that the planets move. Let me just say a quick note about rabbinic time. There are 12 hours of sunlight and 12 hours of darkness every day Jewishly. An hour is 1/12 of the amount of sunlight or daylight that exists in that day. Okay, an hour is not 60 minutes. Remember, they're living in a world where time is not something that exists. There's not clocks, right? The closest you have to a clock is a sundial. And the closest you have to an absolute with the sundial is when the sun is directly overhead. So you know when the midpoint of the daylight is, and that's called 6 hours.
How do you know when midnight is?
Midnight is tougher, right? It helps that Israel is not that far from the equator. So we're not talking Scandinavian winters or summers here. But so we have another answer here. Rabban Gamliel, however, says you can say the evening Shema, now we seems to be changing the subject, until dawn. And then relates an incident where Rabban Gamliel's sons returned very late from a wedding hall after partying all night and drinking heavily. And they said to them that we had been drinking heavily, so we did not recite the Shema. And he said to them, if the sun has not arrived, you are obligated to still recite. And then we get some more things, and not only that, but rather wherever the sages say until midnight, actually you can go ahead and do it until dawn. So like midnight, they're going back to Suzanne, your issue, right? How do you really know when midnight is? So really, let's just wake up. As long as it's still dark outside, you can go do the things you're supposed to. And then Rabban Gamliel, to prove that you can do it till dawn, gives all sorts of examples of practices at the temple where you were supposed to do it by a certain point, but then you can actually extend it after the fact if you need to. Okay, those of you who did Talmud with me for years are like, oh yeah, this is great, let's keep going here. Back in our comfort zone. And those of you who have not done Talmud before are probably looking at this and going, what is happening here? But again, the big takeaways I want us to see is this attempt by the rabbis to link what they are doing to the temple. Everyone agrees the temple is real and authentic, so let's link ourselves to that. And then this notion that it is not a collection of answers, but instead an anthology of the opinions of the oral Torah. This is not a document for you to pick up so that you can do Jewish. This is, remember how we talked at the beginning about the idea that a rabbi would walk around with a Tana, the memorizer of the oral Torah? This is an attempt to have a written version of those Tanas. That's what we're creating here. And it's an attempt to do that specifically because there had been a destruction of our civilization and a fear that these were going to disappear. Okay, so those are the big takeaways of today. The creation of the Mishnah as a document, the move around the year 200, 220 of the center of Jewish life and civilization back to Babylon, the political nature of rabbinic Jewish identity as a non-Roman rebellion group, and secondarily early Christian identity as a rejection of all of those troublesome Jews who keep rebelling. Okay, those were our big takeaways for today. Thoughts, questions, reactions, ideas? Let's open it up for our last few minutes, and then Rudy's got something for us.
Then one quick question.
I got something for you from us.
Okay, I'll get to you, Rudy. I promise we won't forget. Speaking of not forgetting, a reminder, no class next Tuesday. We will be back the week after. You should tell us. Go ahead.
Again, question about the rise of anti-Semitism. Could you just sort of reiterate that, please?
Yeah. First of all, let me give you a book recommendation. Anyone who's interested in understanding this better, there's a phenomenal book, very readable. It's called Anti-Judaism, the Western Tradition by Nurnberg. It's a look at anti-Judaism as a non-Jewish phenomenon.
Anti-Judaism, the what?
The Western Tradition. And his last name is, I think, Nurnberg. But in the same way that white supremacy is a white phenomenon, anti-Judaism is a non-Jewish phenomenon, if that makes sense. And this is an attempt to look at anti-Judaism through that lens. And he goes through the very earliest precursors all the way through today. The reference to Western tradition is a little bit of a pun or a little bit of a play on words. The first is he's making a point about how core anti-Judaism is to the West and Western tradition and Western civilization and thought. But the other point he is making is that he is not looking at the anti-Semitism of the Islamic world. It is strictly of the eventually Christian world that he's looking at with this book. Really great book, really readable, highly recommended. I make all my Eden Seminary students, almost regardless of the class that I'm teaching, read this book because it is so powerful around that. But, Ben, I don't think you can think of anti-Semitism during this period. There's intense Roman anti-Judeanness that has to do with all the rebellions and how problematic we are within the Roman Empire. Again, we are one of the larger minorities, probably 10 to 15% of the Roman Empire. So we also get the discrimination that seems to come with any large minority in a society. But it's not anti-Semitism as we would understand it yet. That anti-Semitism today is really a Christian cultural phenomenon that certainly has its origins in some Egyptian texts and in this Roman era. But this is really anti-Judaism or anti-Judeanism that we are seeing at this moment. There's also probably something like an anti-Semitism that we're getting in Greek culture as a response to the Jewish civilizational competition with Greek philosophy. We're probably getting some of that there too. But at this point, it's much more nationalistic and anti-nationalistic than it is racial or ethnic. And again, there, right, even those categories are going to get created later. Good question, though. And check out that book. Really recommend it to just about anyone who's interested. It's a phenomenal book. Marion. You unmuted for a second and then muted again. Go for it.
Am I unmuted now? Am I okay?
You're good.
Who other than the rabbis is reading or paying attention to this? Early Christians of either the Pauline or Jerusalem variety, are they looking at it? Or are there Jews looking at it? Who cares other than the rabbis?
Yeah, that's a great question with a significant amount of debate around it. Israeli scholars tend to take rabbinic mythology more at face value. American scholarship tends to I follow American scholarship on this in the view that the rabbis are fringy. So my answer is just looking at the texts we've looked at, right? Look at the Gospel of Matthew, and Jesus is hanging out in the synagogue with rabbis or Pharisees or whatever name you want to call them. Even the synagogue, the fact that there's a synagogue, we're talking about non-Jerusalem, non-temple centered, meaning non-normative Jewish practice. The Essenes, or the Zealots, right? We looked at the story of how the leader of the Zealots is Rabbi Yochanan's son-in-law or nephew, or I'm forgetting, nephew maybe? That sounds right. Whatever. Again, we're seeing how close these relationships are between all of these groups. So I am sure that many of these groups also shared broad worldview, cosmology about the existence of an oral Torah. But many of these groups also are just scattered by the time we get to the year 200. I've said it over and over again, but Jewish civilization is pretty destroyed around the land of Israel, certainly centered around Jerusalem by the time we get to the year 200. And so this is an attempt to preserve these sayings. And then sending them off to Babylonian Jewry is sending them off to Jews who had been in the business of doing Jewish and being Jewish far away from the land of Israel for, at this point, 700 years. Right? I've mentioned it again and again, and we'll keep coming back to it. And it's hard to mention this without contemporary politics, though, again, I think this is actually one of the most important things people need to understand about Israel today, is these civilizations, these Jewish civilizations in Babylon and Persia, meaning Iraq and Iran, these are civilizations that exist from 586 BCE until they are ethnically cleansed in the 60s and 70s. And almost all of them end up making their way to Israel and face huge discrimination once they get to Israel, and then become the most right-wing voting bloc of contemporary Israeli politics. The cycle continues, right? It's the story of Purim right there. But regardless, this is an ongoing Jewish civilization that by the time we're talking the Mishnah is 700 years old, which is just wild. Stephen. And you've got on mute.
Yeah, thank you. What was Paul's role in anti-Semitism?
I'm sorry, I lost you. What was
St. Paul's role in anti-Semitism, and what was the status of Christianity in the year 200?
Yeah, so you have to understand Paul again through the politics of a moment of Jewish rebellion against Rome.
That was my understanding.
Paul's distancing.
He wrote that to himself with the Romans.
Yeah.
And we've been living with it ever since.
Exactly. Paul's intentional distancing and dissing of Jews and Jewish practices and Jewish groups, and is very much about politically distancing his new group from Jews when it comes to relationship with the Romans. The Romans are the boss. Again, go back to our analogy of American occupation of Iraq. Think about the groups that would want to actively distance themselves from Saddam Hussein, from ISIS, from whatever it is, in order to get in good with the Americans. And vice versa. Think of the groups who would work to antagonize the Americans in order to get in good with other groups. And those are the politics of this moment. And just like you said, the anti-Semitism that we have lived with for thousands of years really has nothing to do with the why of why Paul is saying these things, or why these early Christians are working so hard to distance themselves from Roman association with them and the Jews. Did that make sense? Did we sort of land that plane there? Okay, any last questions before we go to Rudy?
Steve's still talking. No,
okay, Rudy wants everyone to unmute themselves. Is that correct, Rudy?
Yeah, please.
Anyone who would like to, go for it.
All right, whoever wants to sing happy birthday to Dan.
Happy
birthday
to you.
Happy birthday to you. Happy birthday, dear Daniel. Happy birthday to you. Jump around the room. Jump around the room.
Oh, yeah, there you go. We'll do a camp style.
Jump around the room.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you.
Happy birthday.
That cacophony was wonderful. And someone made cakes go all over my over here. Yeah.
Does that count as a bingo, Rabbi?
Exactly. Those who didn't see, one of my 10-year-olds who comes to services with me on Friday nights made a bingo sheet of things that I guess I oversay during services.
Well, how did you like it, Daniel?
Oh, we have not stopped laughing. We have not stopped. I feel seen.
How did you like us singing to you?
Amazing. Thank you, Rudy. Very sweet. Very sweet. Okay, I got to book it out of here because I'm teaching Intro to Judaism out at Temple Emmanuel. So good to be with everyone, and it's so nice to still have it be light outside. And again, I'll say it one last time, no class next week.
You can still sing happy birthday as long as it's light outside, right?
That's the rule.
Absolutely.
See you
Recording
See you
stopped.
Saturday, Rabbi.
See you then.
Thanks.